Hi, I'm Andre Koen. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us for this particular presentation. And I want to make it very clear that we hold no copyrights for any external resources that are used in this presentation. The objective of this is to really provide people with an educational experience, and so all those materials are used to that end. So we also have some thought processes that we've added into these presentations, and I just want to make sure that you know that the content and some of those processes belong to their rightful agencies, presenters, and organizations. So this idea of moral positioning, there will be three topics that we'll talk about in this particular presentation. This idea of moral positioning, the loss of our humanity, helping to move clients through the grief and loss of an oppressive system. And what is the matter being our capstone piece, and really talking about Black lives, all lives, and democracy. So we will engage in that conversation. Our first session So there'll be three content areas that we'll deal with, and the first is this idea of moral positioning. And in that particular session, we'll talk about how it is or why it is that we have a moral imperative to make the lives of all of our clients and our coworkers better. So what is our moral imperative to do that? Secondly, we'll talk about this idea of loss of humanity, moving clients through the grief of an oppressive reality. And so how do we help our clients, how do we help ourselves move through a system that is perpetuating a number of negative ways of either viewing ourselves or viewing our neighbors? And then thirdly, what is the matter? Black lives, all lives, and democracy. And so we'll spend some time talking about those three ideas and how they interplay with one another. And so those will be the things that we'll address in this particular session. So let's start with So we'll start with this idea of moral positioning. And so what is the moral imperative for us to make the lives of our clients, our coworkers, and ourselves better? And how do we get to some practical ways that we can help make lives better? And I would suggest that as we go through this lesson that you'll see that the preservation of our humanity becomes paramount in order to make sure that people get what they need in ways that they need them. In ways that they need the things that they need. All right? There is a moral imperative for this idea of justice, that we not only want our processes or our judicial system to give fair punishment, but we also want this idea of justice. And so when we talk about justice, what do we mean by justice? And so it's important to recognize that there are ways to do things that are right, and then there are the right things to do. And when we talk about this idea of justice, what we're really talking about is, what are the right things to do? How do we create environments and perpetuate ways of being that secure that we're doing the right thing? And so there's this conversation that we have to have about the balance between this concept of freedom and the concept of liberty. Oftentimes people get those words, or they try to use them interchangeably. And what I would suggest is that when we do that, we miss opportunities, or we miss the effectiveness of each of those concepts. So let's first talk about this idea of freedom. What is freedom? And I would like to submit to you that freedom is a concept that denotes membership. That you get freedom via your membership. Example, there are health clubs around the cities that will allow you to come in and with a guest pass use all of their materials. So you can go to the swimming pool, you can go work out, you can go into the sauna. However, you do not have full access to everything that they have or everything that they offer until you become a member. So once you get membership, you have the freedom to move about. I would say that the activities that you can do in a health club are the same activities that you can do on your own. I can go swimming at the lake. I can jog around my neighborhood as opposed to jogging on a track. I can lift weights on my own. I have the liberty to do so. So what is the difference between these two concepts, or why is the differentiation of those concepts important? Well, when we talk about this idea of freedom, we recognize that freedom is for members, and so then we have to ask ourselves, how do you become a member of a society? And in our great documents, the preamble to the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, do they talk about this idea of freedom, or do they talk about this idea of liberty? And when they talk about those two things, what do they mean? What was the context by which these things were created? Who was allowed to have membership and who was not allowed to have membership? Who was able to participate in the great democracy that we've created, and who has been held back or limited in their ability to participate in those great democracies? So this idea of freedom versus justice is extremely important as we talk about how do we help our clients and our co-workers operate from a better moral position. Secondly, what is social justice? So social justice oftentimes is one of those buzzwords, right? Like diversity. If you ask a certain number of people, you'll get a certain number of different answers given however you encounter those folks, or the context by which you encounter those folks. And what I like to just say is that social justice is making sure that everyone has access to two things. One is all of their civil rights based in our society, and I'm only going to use the United States as the premise of my presentation. So in the United States, making sure everyone has access to their civil rights, and secondly, making sure that human beings have access to their or understand the Declaration of Human Rights. And so with those two things in mind, then we can have a better idea of how to deal with this idea of social justice. What is it? It is not the touchy-feely stuff. It is actually this idea that we can create and interact with folks in ways that solidify what the law says that they need to have. Now, what we also know that if we want to have justice, that there are laws that are right, and then there are laws that are just. And there's a difference between those two, and the difference is extremely important. Slavery was right. It was lawful. It was legal. But it was not just. And so when we think about how do we include people, we talk about this idea of moral positioning. We take into account that there are things that are legal, but then there are things that are just, and they may not necessarily be the same thing. And so how do we wrestle with those things, or how we wrestle with those things, is extremely important as we advance this idea of this moral positioning. Dr. King was jailed on many occasions for standing up for his rights. And those people who jailed him were justified because he was breaking unjust laws. Right now there's a conversation about these this group of people referred to as Black Lives Matter, and how they're being disruptive to systems, to traffic, to transcontinental airlines, and disruptive to people getting lattes at their favorite coffee shop. One of the things that we can't have a celebration of Dr. King and a damning of the movements that he started. And so when you take Dr. King and you appreciate what he had to offer, you also have to recognize that came through struggle. There were people who called him a rebel rouser or a troublemaker. And so when we look at these Black Lives Matter folks who are standing up for their rights, we have to put them in the same line and lineage as Gandhi, as Dr. King, as Nelson Mandela, people who have stood up for their rights. And so they were trying to find that moral positioning where there's a balance between what is right and what is just. And so when we talk about those just laws, those become extremely important. One thing I will say or I like to ask of my folks who consider themselves to be advocates, when you think about the journey that Dr. King took, and you think about this idea of all the speeches that he gave, if you can only come up with one, then you have homework to do. You have homework to do. And so we'll move on in this presentation.